They lied to you again. The real Pocahontas wasn't some pale Disney princess in buckskin. She was described as dark. Her people said she was mixed. And her bloodline, yeah, it runs deeper than they'll ever admit. Because the truth is, Pocahontas had African roots. Not metaphorical, real, traceable genetic roots. Before you roll your eyes, understand this. The earliest records, the diaries, even colonial letters from Jamestown, point to an African presence woven into the native tribes long before Europeans wrote their first fairy tale. But your schools skipped that part, didn't they? They gave you the G-rated love story between her and John Smith, a story so clean, so whitewashed, it could pass for propaganda. Because that's exactly what it was. They sold you a myth. The loyal native girl who saved the white man's life, learned his language, married his kind, and symbolized peace between races. But what if that story wasn't about peace? It was about control. What if the image of Pocahontas was rewritten to hide something much bigger? That black and native people were already united long before colonizers ever touched the coast. That the Indian princess they put on murals and stamps wasn't just a symbol of submission, but a symbol of suppression, of who she really was. Let's get one thing straight. Long before England ever planted its flag, Africans were already living, marrying and raising families within indigenous nations up and down the coast. This isn't a theory, it's documented. Colonial governors complained about Negro Indians forming alliances. Plantation owners passed laws to punish runaways who flee among the Indians. Why? Because they were terrified of what happens when two oppressed peoples unite. And Pocahontas, the daughter of Chief Powhatan, the most powerful ruler of the Chesapeake tribes, became the perfect figure to rewrite. They couldn't afford to show a dark-skinned woman connected to Africans and native leaders, so they bleached her memory, painted her light, and called her civilized. But the records don't lie. The original descriptions of Pocahontas called her dusky, tawny, and swarthy, terms Europeans used for people of African or mixed descent. Her tribe, the Powhatan Confederacy, had already been blending with Africans who escaped from early Spanish expeditions decades before Jamestown. That means the world Pocahontas grew up in wasn't some isolated woodland fairy tale. It was a cultural crossroads where Africa, America, and survival met. The question isn't if there was African blood in her lineage. The question is why that truth was buried. Think about it. Why turn her into a storybook figure who saved the invaders that destroyed her own people? Why erase her color, her culture, and her complexity? Because she wasn't just a woman. They made her a weapon, a tool to teach submission, a trophy to show that even the wild tribes could be tamed by Europe's charm. And it worked. They paraded her through London like a curiosity, renamed her Rebecca, and showed her off to the royal court as proof that the English could civilize the so-called savages. They dressed her in lace, painted her pale, and killed her spirit with praise. But behind every forced smile, behind every staged portrait, there was a truth they couldn't erase. She wasn't theirs to define. Pocahontas represented a world that existed before England's arrogance, a world where African, native and indigenous bloodlines mixed freely, where identity wasn't owned by colonizers, but created by survivors. They want you to believe her story started with John Smith. Nah, it started long before that, across oceans and tribes that Europe refused to understand. The real story of Pocahontas isn't about a girl who saved a white man. It's about a people who tried to save their culture, and how a system of lies turned her into a legend they could sell. Because when you start to uncover who Pocahontas really was, the whole picture of early America starts to shake. It forces you to ask if they lied about her. What else did they rewrite? See, you can't tell the real story of Pocahontas if you started at Jamestown. That's where their version begins, because that's where they controlled the pen. But her story doesn't start with English ships. It starts long before them, in a world they pretend never existed. A world where Africans were already here. Yeah, Before Columbus, before Plymouth, before any New World nonsense. Historians hate admitting it, but the records are sitting right there. Africans trading, settling, and surviving alongside native tribes up and down the Atlantic coast. And once you know that, Pocahontas stops looking like an isolated Indian princess and starts looking like what she was, a child of two worlds that had already met without Europe's permission. That's why I'm giving you this backstory. Because if you don't understand what Virginia looked like before Jamestown, you'll never see why her life was rewritten. By the time the English arrived in 1607, Africans and native peoples already had decades of shared history, alliances, marriages, even whole families. Spanish expeditions had dropped Africans on these shores as early as the 1500s. Some were enslaved, others escaped into freedom and found refuge among the tribes. The Spanish wrote about it, calling them negros fugitivos, the runaways, who vanished into the forests and never came back. But they didn't vanish, they blended. They built new lives. They learned each other's languages, shared crops, built shelter, and created something the colonizers couldn't control: unity. Imagine that, black men and women, tired of chains, finding safety in native villages, tribes who saw them not as strangers, but as allies. That was the world Pocahontas was born into. A world already layered with color, culture, and connection. Her father, Chief Powhatan, ruled over 30 tribes that stretched across the Chesapeake, and within his confederacy were people who had already mixed with Africans from those early contacts. Some of the earliest English settlers even wrote about it, describing dark Indians with features they couldn't explain. They didn't understand, they were seeing generations of shared ancestry. That history matters because it changes everything. It explains why colonial law later worked so hard to divide black from native. It explains why Pocahontas's complexion, her language, her lineage, all got rewritten. The English couldn't afford for her to represent a culture that had already fused Africa and America together. So when they painted her pale and renamed her Rebecca, they weren't just erasing a woman, they were erasing proof that Africans and natives had already built something powerful together. So yeah, this backstory isn't filler, it's the foundation. Without it, their version makes sense. With it, their version falls apart. Because once you know Africans were already here, you start realizing the so-called discovery of America wasn't discovery at all, it was disruption. Pocahontas's world wasn't waiting for Europe, it was thriving without it. And that's the part of the story they never wanted told. See, you can't tell the real story of Pocahontas if you started at Jamestown. That's where their version begins, because that's where they controlled the pen. But her story doesn't start with English ships. It starts long before them, in a world they pretend never existed, a world where Africans were already here. Yeah, before Columbus, before Plymouth, before any New World nonsense. Historians hate admitting it, but the records are sitting right there. Africans trading, settling, and surviving alongside native tribes up and down the Atlantic coast. And once you know that, Pocahontas stops looking like an isolated Indian princess and starts looking like what she was, a child of two worlds that had already met without Europe's permission. That's why I'm giving you this backstory, because if you don't understand what Virginia looked like before Jamestown, you'll never see why her life was rewritten. By the time the English arrived in 1607, Africans and native peoples already had decades of shared history, alliances, marriages, even whole families. Spanish expeditions had dropped Africans on these shores as early as the 1500s. Some were enslaved, others escaped into freedom and found refuge among the tribes. The Spanish wrote about it, calling them negros fugitivos, the runaways who vanished into the forests and never came back. But they didn't vanish. They blended. They built new lives. They learned each other's languages, shared crops, built shelter, and created something the colonizers couldn't control: unity. Imagine that. Black men and women, tired of chains, finding safety in native villages. Tribes who saw them not as strangers, but as allies. That was the world Pocahontas was born into. A world already layered with color, culture, and connection. Her father, Chief Powhatan, ruled over 30 tribes that stretched across the Chesapeake, and within his confederacy were people who had already mixed with Africans from those early contacts. Some of the earliest English settlers even wrote about it, describing dark Indians with features they couldn't explain. They didn't understand they were seeing generations of shared ancestry. That history matters because it changes everything. It explains why colonial law later worked so hard to divide black from native. It explains why Pocahontas's complexion, her language, her lineage, all got rewritten. The English couldn't afford for her to represent a culture that had already fused Africa and America together. So when they painted her pale and renamed her Rebecca, they weren't just erasing a woman, they were erasing proof that Africans and natives had already built something powerful together. So yeah, this backstory isn't filler. It's the foundation. Without it, their version makes sense. With it, their version falls apart. Because once you know Africans were already here, you start realizing the so-called discovery of America wasn't discovery at all. It was disruption. Pocahontas's world wasn't waiting for Europe. It was thriving without it. And that's the part of the story they never wanted told. When the first Africans were dragged to these shores, not everyone stayed in chains. Some broke free before the plantations even took shape. They ran into the wilderness, and what they found there wasn't just trees and rivers. They found people. People who spoke different languages, but shared the same enemy. That's where the story of unity begins. Not in rebellion, but in recognition. The native tribes saw something in those Africans that the colonists never could: strength, spirit, and survival. They didn't see property. They saw kin. It wasn't long before those who escaped the English settlements began finding shelter with indigenous nations. Records from early Virginia and the Carolinas describe dark fugitives living among tribes, marrying, having children, and blending into the culture. To the English, this was chaos. To the Africans and natives, it was freedom. Out there, away from the walls of the colony, they built something the colonizers couldn't understand: community. That's the part history doesn't like to talk about, because if you admit Africans and Native Americans stood side by side before the nation was even born, you have to admit that America's first alliances weren't white and European. They were black and indigenous. And those alliances were dangerous to the colonial order. A runaway African could teach a native warrior how to fight the settlers' tactics, and a native could teach that runaway how to live off the land, how to move through the forests without leaving a trace. Together they became a force the colonies couldn't contain. Governor Berkeley of Virginia wrote about it, frustrated that Negroes and Indians do often combine and run away into the woods. That wasn't just a problem, it was a nightmare for the colonies. Every time a slave escaped into a native village, it chipped away at the system. Every new alliance was a spark, and soon they realized they couldn't stop it by force alone. So they used something more powerful: law. They began drafting racial codes that would divide Africans and natives forever, outlawing marriages, punishing friendships, and branding both as enemies if they helped each other. But before that wedge was driven between them, they were building entire families. Oral histories from both African American and Native communities still talk about the Black Indians, children born of both worlds. They lived freely, spoke multiple languages, and carried knowledge from 2 continents. These were the ancestors of the Black Seminoles, the Maroon societies, and the Gullah Geechee people. who would later rise across the South. They were the proof that unity wasn't a dream, it was real. And this is where Pocahontas's story fits back in, because the Powhatan Confederacy, her father's world, wasn't cut off from these exchanges. The trade routes that connected tribes stretched far south, into areas where Africans had already made contact. When she was born, the mix of African and indigenous bloodlines was already part of the landscape. So when the English arrived, they didn't step into a pure, untouched world. They stepped into one that had already evolved beyond their imagination. That's what makes the myth of Pocahontas so strategic. She became the perfect tool to rewrite that reality. They couldn't have the face of that unity, a dark-skinned woman from a blended world, front and center. So they bleached her. They recast her as the good Indian, the one who helped the settlers instead of resisting them. Because if they admitted she came from a people who had already allied with Africans, their whole story of discovery and civilizing the New World would fall apart. This alliance, these runaways, these mixed families, that's the soil Pocahontas's life grew from. And that's why her truth was so dangerous, because she didn't just represent peace between races, she represented proof that the colonizers were late to the party. The land wasn't waiting to be found. The people weren't waiting to be saved. They were already building something together, and that's the part of history that couldn't survive in their textbooks. To really understand Pocahontas, you have to understand the empire she was born into. Her father, Chief Powhatan, whose real name was Wahunsanako, didn't rule a few scattered villages. He ruled an empire. Over 30 tribes made up his confederacy, stretching from the Atlantic coast deep into what's now Virginia. Each had its own leader, its own culture, its own rhythm, yet they all moved under Powhatan's hand, bound by trade, diplomacy, and survival. This wasn't some primitive cluster of people. It was a structured nation with roads, taxation, and social hierarchy. That's what the English couldn't process, that before they even arrived, this land already had government, order, and power. Now, here's where things get interesting. When the English first met the Powhatans, they didn't understand who they were looking at. They wrote about their tawny, or dark brown skin, their complexions that reminded them of the Moors. Yes, those Moors, the Africans who once ruled Spain. Some even described them as of complexion nearer to the Ethiopians than the English. Those aren't my words. They're from their own journals. And it tells you something. The people of Powhatan's Confederacy didn't fit neatly into the categories Europe was trying to build. They were brown, mixed, and connected. They were what America actually looked like before race became law. See, the Chesapeake wasn't isolated. The Powhatan Confederacy traded north and south. They had access to copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Carolinas, and stories that traveled faster than ships. Within those trade routes came Africans, the escaped, the shipwrecked, the explorers from earlier contact. They weren't mythic lost souls. They were real people who merged into tribes and communities like the Pamunkey, the Chickahominy, and the Nottoway, the same world Pocahontas grew up in. And that explains the deep fear English colonizers felt when they first arrived. They weren't walking into a land of savages. They were walking into a federation, a system that worked, thrived, and didn't need them. That's why their writings described Powhatan not as a chief but as a king, because in their eyes, only a kingdom could command that much structure and loyalty. And when they looked at Pocahontas, they saw royalty. They just couldn't stand that the face of that royalty didn't look like theirs. Now, think about the power in that image. A young girl growing up as the daughter of a leader who ruled more territory than some European nations. She was born into wealth, diplomacy, and influence. Yet, over time, the colonizers flipped her story into one of obedience, the good native, who helped the white man survive. But Pocahontas came from a bloodline that didn't serve outsiders, it commanded them. She wasn't some forest child wandering barefoot through nature. She was raised in the halls of a government, in a world of trade, strategy, and politics. And this confederacy wasn't untouched by African presence, it was shaped by it. The Powhatan's darker tone, their cultural openness, and even some of their agricultural practices show African influence. The same crops, yams, rice, okra, that would later define Southern black culture, already had roots in indigenous trade systems, influenced by earlier African arrivals. The English didn't see this as connection, they saw it as confusion. They couldn't tell where Indian ended and African began, so they decided to draw their own lines. That's why, decades later, they'd start passing laws that separated black and native people by force. But in Pocahontas's lifetime, those lines didn't exist. Her father's kingdom wasn't divided by skin tone or blood quantum. It was united by survival. The Powhatan world was a kingdom of color, blended, adaptive, and open in ways Europe couldn't comprehend. When you realize that, you start to see the brilliance in their structure and the threat it posed to colonization, because the English didn't just want land, they wanted narrative. They needed to paint the Powhatans as primitive, so they could justify their takeover. But how do you sell that lie when the people you're trying to conquer are running a political system that looks more advanced than your own? Easy. You rewrite their history, you take their symbols, their leaders, and their daughters, and you make them props in your story. That's what they did to Pocahontas. They took the child of a kingdom built on diplomacy, mixed ancestry and power, and turned her into a submissive myth. They stripped her of her African ties, her royal stature, and her agency, then sold her as a peacekeeper. But she wasn't born to be peace. She was born from power. Every empire that conquers learns one lesson early. If you can't control a people's body, control their bloodline. The English understood that. They didn't just come to take land. They came to rewrite inheritance. And when they got here and realized Africans and natives were already mixing, already marrying, already building families that defied the neat boxes of slave and Indian, they panicked. That panic turned into policy. And that's when the erasure began. You see, Pocahontas wasn't the only one they rewrote. She was just the most visible. Her bloodline became the blueprint for how to control identity in the New World. Think about it. A dark-skinned royal woman, daughter of a Confederacy leader, connected through trade and lineage to African-descended people. That's not the image of submission they wanted. So they flipped it. They made her the symbol of unity under white control, not unity against it. But behind her public story were hundreds of families just like hers, mixed, free, and untraceable by colonial logic. Those were the families that had to be erased from paper if the European version of America was going to hold. The first generation of black Indians threatened the entire colonial system because they shattered the idea of racial hierarchy before it was fully built. They didn't fit. You couldn't enslave them easily. Not when they could blend into native tribes. You couldn't categorize them. Not when their bloodlines linked two worlds that refused to be owned. And that's what led to one of the most destructive tools in early America, the invention of racial law. By the mid-1600s, colonial courts were already debating what to do about the children of African and Native unions. One Virginia record refers to them as of confused blood. Another document complains about Negroes frequenting among the Indians. Their solution? Redefine freedom itself. They created legal codes stating that a person's status, free or enslaved, would now follow the mother's line. Why? Because African women were being enslaved. That way, any child born from an African woman, even if the father was native or European, would still be a slave. That law wasn't about justice, it was about economics. It made sure blackness became the anchor of bondage, and any connection to freedom through native lineage was legally severed. That's how you erase a bloodline. You trap it in paper. Those early black Indian families started disappearing from records not because they vanished, but because the law stopped acknowledging them. Birth certificates changed, race labels shifted, and over generations, families who once called themselves Pamunkey, Nottoway, or Creek were forced to choose sides to survive. Be native and risk losing protection. Be black and risk losing freedom. Either way, the law won. Now think about how that plays into Pocahontas's legacy. When she was paraded around England, she was pregnant with a child by John Rolfe, a child they called the first mixed-race American. But that's a lie too. That child wasn't the first anything. He was part of an ongoing pattern, but the acceptable one. His whiteness made him marketable. His black and native predecessors were scrubbed from the story. The colonists could only stomach the idea of mixed heritage if it was under their control. A product of assimilation, not defiance. Even her descendants were rewritten. Generations later, families claiming to descend from Pocahontas were accepted into colonial high society, as long as they didn't look too dark. The bloodline stayed, but the melanin disappeared in the record books. That's not coincidence, that's systemic bleaching. They whitened her memory so they could whiten her lineage. It's the same tactic used across the colonies. They passed paper genocide laws, forcing tribes to reclassify their people as colored or mulatto, just to erase their sovereignty. They didn't kill every tribe, they erased them on paper. That's how you end a nation without firing a shot. And it's why so many African Americans today have native ancestry, but no record to prove it. The system was designed to bury that truth before it could ever be claimed. So when you hear stories about Pocahontas's bloodline, remember her real legacy wasn't just one family tree. It was the entire forest they cut down to make sure that tree stood alone. Because as long as she was the only one, they could control the narrative. But she wasn't the only one. She was just the one they couldn't hide completely. And that's the power of this story. It's not just about her skin or her marriage. It's about the world her blood represented. A world where identity was fluid, alliances were real, and color wasn't a cage. That's the world they had to erase, to build the one we're living in now. Here's the part they'll never teach in schools. One of the first things the American colonies ever outlawed wasn't theft, or murder, or even rebellion. It was unity. The colonies didn't just fear rebellion from Africans or indigenous people individually. They feared what would happen if the two joined forces. Because when the oppressed start recognizing each other in the struggle, empires start trembling. In 1662, Virginia passed a law that changed everything. A law that said a child's status would follow the condition of the mother. Sounds simple, right? But it wasn't. It meant if your mother was enslaved, you were enslaved forever, no matter who your father was. That law quietly destroyed entire bloodlines. It locked black women and their children into generational bondage and cut off native people from claiming mixed descendants. It was the first domino in a system that turned unity into a crime. Then came 1691, the year they made it official. The Virginia Assembly passed a law explicitly banning marriage between Africans, Native Americans, and Europeans. It was the first recorded law in North America to criminalize interracial unions, but they didn't stop there. The law said anyone English or other white who married a Negro or Indian would be banished from the colony. Think about that. You could murder someone and get a lighter sentence than if you fell in love across color lines. Because love was a threat to the system, They called it racial integrity. What it really meant was control. They needed to keep the oppressed divided, keep people arguing about identity instead of questioning power. Because when Africans ran to native nations, they didn't just escape chains, they escaped categories. In those alliances, they weren't Negro or Indian or slave. They were free people again, and that terrified the colonies more than anything else. So they began erasing the evidence. Colonial records stopped mentioning black Indians. Instead, they replaced those words with mulatto, a term vague enough to erase both African and native heritage. One word, one label, used like a knife to cut entire histories off the map. And once those words disappeared from the records, so did the people. But unity didn't die because of a law. The laws just forced it underground. On plantations and in tribal villages, stories still spread, families still remembered. The whispers of shared ancestors, shared struggle, shared love, they couldn't be erased from memory. Even when the law said otherwise, the bloodline kept speaking, and the colonizers knew that. That's why, as late as the 1700s, colonial governors were still complaining about Negroes and Indians who combine in the woods. Combine, that was their word for rebellion. And every time they tried to stamp it out, it came back stronger. Because you can't legislate away what's natural, connection. This wasn't just about race, it was about survival. When Africans and natives came together, they created a new identity that couldn't be owned, tracked, or classified. That's why America had to erase it. Not because it wasn't real, but because it was too powerful. So next time someone talks about melting pots or mixed cultures, remember, that didn't start with Ellis Island. It started in the forests of Virginia, when two oppressed peoples chose each other over fear. That was the first America. The real one. The one they buried under paper and law. If you want to make a people disappear, you don't always need weapons. Sometimes, you just need paperwork. The US government learned that early. When they couldn't erase cultures through war, they turned to something quieter and more permanent: documents. That's how entire bloodlines got rewritten out of existence without anyone hearing a sound. It started with something as simple as the census. When officials went door to door, they weren't just counting people. They were deciding who mattered, who belonged, and who didn't. If your skin was dark, they didn't ask what tribe you came from. They didn't care if your great-grandmother spoke a native language or lived on tribal land. They looked at you, made a judgment, and wrote down one word. That one decision changed your family's history forever. This happened across the country. Families who carried both African and native bloodlines, the Rappahannock, the Nottoway, the Lumbee, the Catawba, were quietly reclassified. The next generation wasn't listed as native at all. They were colored. Then their children became black. Over time, the native part of their identity vanished on paper. That's how entire nations disappeared from records, not because they stopped existing, but because someone behind a desk decided they didn't. It wasn't just the census either. Schools, churches, and even courts started following those same rules. If you didn't fit the image of what they wanted native to look like, light skin, straight hair, they rewrote your identity. And when they did that to enough people, whole communities were erased from public memory. You couldn't prove who you were anymore, because the government had already decided for you. Later, when the federal government started creating official tribal rolls, they took it even further. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the Dole's rolls were supposed to record who was part of native nations. But the people making those lists, mostly white officials, used their own eyes to decide who counted. If you were too dark, they labeled you freedmen, meaning your ancestors had once been enslaved,
and denied you the same recognition as other tribal members. They didn't ask about your lineage. They didn't care about your family's role in the tribe. They just separated people by how they looked. That's how many black native families lost land, rights, and recognition, not through war, but through paper. Once you were labeled freedmen, you were no longer seen as part of the tribe, and even today, that label still follows people. Some descendants of those same families are still fighting to be recognized, even though their ancestors lived and fought beside the very leaders those records praised. This wasn't confusion, it was control. By erasing the paperwork that proved who you were, they could own the story of who you became. Because if they could make you forget your native blood, they could make you forget your connection to the land. But that story didn't die, it just went underground. You still hear it today in conversations that start with, "My grandma said we had Cherokee in us." You see it in faces, family trees, and traditions passed down quietly, braiding patterns, songs, herbal medicines, the way elders speak about the old people. That's not myth, that's memory, and memory is powerful. You can rewrite documents, but you can't rewrite blood. That's why, no matter how many forms they changed, the truth still finds a way to resurface. Every generation has a few who go looking, who refuse to let the story end. Because even if the records don't show it, the legacy of that unity between African and Native never stopped flowing through our veins.
Now this is where the story gets wild, because when we talk about the Seminoles, we're not talking about a single tribe. We're talking about one of the greatest alliances in American history. The word Seminole itself comes from Cimarron, meaning runaway or free one. And that's exactly what they were, runaways from a world that tried to cage them. Africans escaping bondage, Native Americans escaping invasion, two peoples with the same enemy and the same dream, freedom. Down in Spanish Florida, long before it became a U.S. territory, the swamps became a safe haven. Africans fleeing from the plantations in Georgia and the Carolinas found refuge among the native peoples already living there. Mainly Creeks, Yamasees, and remnants of earlier tribes. But this wasn't charity, this was partnership. They traded knowledge, married into each other's families, built villages side by side, and defended their lands together. Over time, they became one people, the Seminole Nation. And here's what makes it so powerful. These were some of the first truly free black communities in what would become the United States. They weren't hiding, they were thriving. They built towns, farmed their own land, and created a new identity. Part African, part Native, 100% independent. The U.S. government called them Maroons, but in truth, they were the first freedom fighters on American soil. The alliance was strong enough to shake an empire. The U.S. military spent decades trying to break it, launching not one but 3 wars against the Seminoles, and still couldn't win outright. The Black Seminoles fought side by side with their native brothers and sisters, using guerrilla tactics that terrified U.S. soldiers. They knew the swamps better than anyone, striking fast and vanishing into the trees before anyone could catch them. The government called them rebels. History should call them heroes. But what made them dangerous wasn't just their skill, it was their unity. They didn't see race the way America did. They didn't separate black from Indian. They saw family. Some spoke native languages, others spoke Creole or Spanish, but their loyalty was the same. They didn't care about what box you checked. They cared about whether you were willing to fight for your people. The United States couldn't handle that. So once again they tried to break the bond with paper. Treaties were signed, broken, and rewritten, always to divide. Officials offered the native Seminoles peace if they handed over their black allies. Some refused, others gave in under pressure. The government's goal was simple: separate them, because together they were unbeatable. Even after being forced out during the Trail of Tears, the bond didn't die. Black Seminoles moved west into what's now Oklahoma and Texas, some even crossing into Mexico, where they were welcomed as soldiers. There they were called the Masco, still fighting, still free, and today, their descendants still live in both Mexico and the U.S., carrying on the legacy of two worlds that refused to bow. The Black Seminoles weren't just survivors, they were a warning. Their story showed that unity between Africans and natives could build a nation stronger than any colony, stronger than any empire. That's why you rarely hear their name in classrooms, because their existence exposes one truth America's never been comfortable with, that the first people to truly live free on this land weren't the ones who claimed to discover it. So when you hear Seminole, don't just think of a tribe in Florida, think of resistance. Think of blended bloodlines standing together in the swamp, defying the impossible. Think of people who refused to let the world tell them who they were. That's the real story, one of the greatest alliances in American history, built by the very people history tried to erase. Before America called itself the land of the free, freedom was already being built, in the shadows, by people it refused to see. Across the South, hidden deep in forests, swamps, and river valleys, there were entire towns that weren't supposed to exist, but they did, built by black natives, escaped Africans, and indigenous allies. These were not just camps of survivors, they were civilizations. They had governments, rules, and leaders. They had schools where elders taught language, survival, farming, and history. Not the European kind, but the truth that came from the land and the ancestors. They traded with nearby native nations, hunted together, and grew food that kept entire regions alive. And the wild part, many of these towns lasted longer than the plantations surrounding them. They didn't just survive outside the system, they built one better than the system itself. These were the freedom towns, sometimes called maroon communities. In Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, and especially Florida, you could find pockets of them everywhere. Some were small, a few families living by a river. Others were massive, entire villages hidden in the Everglades, where hundreds of people lived together, free. The most famous ones were tied to the Seminoles, but there were others the world forgot: Angola, Prospect Bluff, and San Malo, early examples of independent black and native communities, thriving long before the Civil War. Take Angola for example, not the one in Africa, but the hidden city in Florida. It was a powerful settlement of both African and native people who escaped slavery and refused to bend to colonial rule. For years, they lived free, trading goods with Spanish ships and neighboring tribes. But when word spread that such a city existed, one where black and native families lived in peace, armed and unbroken, the American government saw it as a threat. They sent forces to destroy it, but the legacy never died. Those who escaped rebuilt elsewhere, carrying the spirit of Angola with them. And then there was Prospect Bluff, known as Negro Fort by the Americans, a fortress on the Apalachicola River, built by Africans, natives, and allies from the British military. It became a stronghold of resistance. For years, it was a beacon for anyone escaping the South's chains, a place that said, "You can come here and be free," and people did. Hundreds, men, women, children. They came, built homes, planted crops, and defended themselves. To the U.S. government, that was unacceptable, because freedom, real freedom, spreading like that, it was contagious. The United States couldn't allow these towns to exist, because every successful one proved the lie of the system. It showed that Africans and natives could govern themselves, build peace, and create prosperity without European intervention. So once again, those communities disappeared from history books. You'll find almost nothing about them in schools, but their ruins still exist, buried in the soil, waiting for someone to ask questions. But the spirit of those towns didn't die with the people who lived there. It passed down through generations, in the rhythms of the drums, in the food still cooked in the South, in the spiritual songs that blend African and native chants.
That's not just coincidence, that's memory turned into culture. These weren't just places of escape, they were proof of possibility. They showed that freedom wasn't something given, it was something built, protected, and passed down. And even now, centuries later, their blueprint is still in us. The belief that we can rise, rebuild, and live free on our own terms. That's not modern, that's ancient. So the next time you hear about the founding fathers of America, remember there were other founders, ones who built without permission, governed without approval, and lived free without a declaration. Black natives were America's first example of what real independence looks like. When you hear the words Trail of Tears, you probably picture one thing: native families walking west, barefoot and broken, pushed from their homelands. That image is burned into every history book. But what those same books leave out is who was walking beside them. Because not everyone on that trail looked the same. Many had dark skin, tight curls, or features that didn't fit the Hollywood image of native. Those were the black natives, the forgotten families who were part of the tribes, part of the land, and part of the suffering. They weren't outsiders tagging along. They were tribal citizens, members of the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations. Some were warriors, some were farmers, some were healers. They spoke the languages, lived the customs, and were just as much a part of those nations as anyone else. But when the U.S. government decided to remove native people from their homes, it didn't care who they were. It saw only color and conquest. See, by the 1830s, these tribes had already been reshaped by centuries of interconnection. African people had been living among them for generations, as free allies, as family, and yes, sometimes as people enslaved, under the same system that had twisted native society. That mix created complex realities. Some tribes, influenced by European ideas of race and ownership, began to adopt practices they never had before. But even then, within many native communities, those of African descent were still kin, not property. So when the forced removals began, the U.S. soldiers didn't bother to separate them. They rounded up entire villages, native, black, and mixed, and pushed them all west. Thousands of people, entire nations, forced to walk over 1,000 miles through cold, hunger, and disease. The history books show the tragedy, but they don't show the faces that carried two worlds in their blood. Eyewitness accounts tell of darker-skinned people among the groups, of entire families with African features marching alongside the tribes. Some of these people would later become known as the Freedmen, black members of the 5 civilized tribes, who endured the same removals, faced the same losses, and rebuilt the same new nations out west. But when history was retold, their presence got erased. Their names didn't make it into the treaties. Their faces didn't make it into the paintings. And yet, the proof is everywhere. The freedmen built schools, churches, and governments within the tribal nations. After removal, they fought in tribal militias, served as interpreters, farmers, and leaders. They helped rebuild what was lost. But when it came time for recognition, for rights, land, or reparations, they were written out again. Not Indian by blood, the government said, as if culture, language, and loyalty meant nothing. This wasn't just loss, it was erasure in real time. A whole generation of black natives who walked that trail were later edited out of the story. The U.S. wanted a neat narrative, the noble native, the savage frontier, the tragic removal. But the presence of black faces complicated that story. It reminded everyone that this land was shared, and that its history was too intertwined for the clean lines America tried to draw. When we talk about the Trail of Tears, we have to understand it wasn't just one people being displaced. It was a blended nation, families made of both Africa and America being torn apart by a system that refused to see their humanity. The trail wasn't just a road of tears, it was a road of memory, carrying the weight of 2 continents, and that memory still walks with their descendants today. The freedmen of the 5 tribes are still fighting to be recognized as full members of their nations, not outsiders, not footnotes, but heirs of the same journey. Their ancestors didn't just walk that trail, they survived it. And their survival is part of the reason the culture still exists today. Because no matter how far they were pushed, they didn't disappear. They rebuilt, they adapted, and they kept the connection alive, proving again that no matter how many times they tried to divide Black and Native people, the bond always found a way to survive.
When the Trail of Tears ended, it didn't really end. The people who survived didn't just lose land. They lost recognition. But what most folks don't realize is how much they rebuilt, because the same ones who walked through that nightmare stood up on the other side and said, "We're still here." That included the Black natives, the freedmen, who carried both African and Native blood, culture, and spirit. And when the dust settled in Indian territory, they helped shape what came next. The freedmen weren't outsiders. They were part of the tribes long before the removals. They built homes, farmed the land, spoke the languages, and lived the customs. When they were forced west, they didn't stop contributing. They became teachers, interpreters, translators, farmers, and lawmakers. They established schools where children learned both Native traditions and Western literacy. They helped draft constitutions and form new tribal governments. They weren't guests, they were the backbone of recovery. But even after all that, when the U.S. government came knocking again after the Civil War, things got messy. The government pressured the tribes to sign new treaties in 1866, treaties that officially freed any enslaved people within the tribes, and granted the freedmen and their descendants full citizenship rights. On paper, that was justice, but in practice, it was the beginning of a new fight, because as the generations passed, those rights were quietly stripped away. When the Dawes rolls were created to divide tribal land into individual plots, the government sent white officials to decide who was Indian by blood and who was freedmen. There was no DNA test, no family tree, no real process, just a white man with a pen. If you were darker skinned, you were listed as freedmen. If your features fit their narrow idea of what Indian looked like, you got placed on the blood rolls. Those rolls decided everything: who got land, who got rights, who got to belong. And just like that, whole families that had lived as part of the tribe for centuries were erased with one stroke of ink. Still, the freedmen didn't vanish. They built their own thriving communities inside the nations. Black towns emerged all across Indian territory: Boley, Taft, Langston, Rentisville, founded and led by freedmen and native descendants. These weren't backwoods settlements. They were booming towns with banks, schools, newspapers, and governments. They had leaders who sat on tribal councils and represented their people with pride. At one point, Oklahoma had more all-black towns than any other state in the country, many born directly from that Black native lineage. But every generation brought a new challenge. As the 20th century came, the U.S. and even some tribal governments started tightening the definition of who counted as Indian. Some tribes, under pressure to fit federal definitions, began removing freedmen descendants from their citizenship rolls altogether. Families who had lived, voted, and paid taxes as part of the tribe for over 100 years suddenly received letters saying they were no longer recognized. No land rights, no citizenship, no belonging, and yet, they still refused to disappear. The freedmen descendants began organizing, researching, and reclaiming their history. They dug through old records, family stories, and court cases to prove what everyone already knew, that they were native, not just by blood, but by legacy. Their fight reached all the way to federal courts, and in 2017, the Cherokee Nation finally ruled that freedmen descendants would be recognized again as full citizens. That victory wasn't just about paperwork, it was about identity, justice, and memory. Because this fight was never just about a name on a roll, it was about belonging. The freedmen's story is proof that you can erase someone from a document, but you can't erase them from history. Their influence runs through tribal culture, language, art, and music.
Oh,
You can see it in the foods, the traditions, even the rhythm of storytelling itself. They didn't just rebuild nations after tragedy, they redefined what those nations could be. Black natives brought something powerful to every nation they touched: resilience. The kind of resilience that doesn't break, it bends and returns stronger. That's what America never gave them, but what they built for themselves. And that's why this story still matters today. Because the fight for recognition didn't end with the Dawes Rolls, it's still happening. Every new generation of freedmen descendants continues to prove that the bond between African and Native people wasn't an accident of history, it was the foundation of survival. You can bury stories, but you can't bury rhythm. And rhythm, that's how you know a people survived. After centuries of rewriting and removal, you can still hear Africa and America speaking to each other through sound, movement, and spirit. The connection didn't vanish, it evolved. When Africans and natives came together, they didn't just mix bloodlines, they mixed worlds. And that mix is still living in the way we talk, the way we move, the way we celebrate. Let's start with the music. Before jazz, before blues, before hip-hop, there were drums echoing through both African and native lands.
oh,
Both cultures believed rhythm was sacred, a heartbeat that connected you to ancestors and earth. When they met, their sounds didn't clash, they completed each other. In the Deep South, early observers wrote about ring shouts, spiritual dances with stomping, clapping, and chanting. They thought it was African, but many of those movements mirrored older native ceremonies: circle dances, call and response prayers, and chant-based worship. Two heritages speaking the same language, through rhythm. The same fusion showed up in food. Native people gave the world corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters. Africans brought okra, yams, and black-eyed peas. Together, they created Southern cuisine: gumbo, cornbread, rice dishes, stews. Food became a memory in disguise. When Africans couldn't bring their old crops, they adapted native ones, seasoning them with African flavor and tradition. That's how survival becomes culture, by turning scarcity into creation. Language blended too. Many native words slipped into African Creole dialects, especially in the Gulf Coast and Caribbean. Words like Kuza, Bayou, and Oklahoma, meaning red people, traveled across both communities. Even spiritual practices intertwined. The idea of spirit animals, ancestor worship, and using herbs for healing, those are bridges between African and native thought. They both believed nature wasn't separate from humanity, it was part of it. That shared worldview kept people grounded when everything else tried to uproot them. And let's talk about family. In both African and native systems, family wasn't limited to blood. It was about community. Elders guided the young, and the young protected the old. That's how oral history stayed alive. When colonizers banned African languages and broke up native families, these shared systems became protection. They made sure knowledge traveled, even if it had to whisper. Today, you still see it everywhere. The powwow drum circle and the black church choir, the stomp dance and the ring shout.
oh,
The herbal medicine woman in Louisiana, who mixes African roots with native plants. The storytelling cadence, that rhythm in our speech that turns a conversation into performance. None of that is coincidence, that's survival artistry. What people call black culture or southern culture is often just African and native culture blended and reborn. It's proof that even under oppression, creativity flourished. They took what was supposed to break them and built identity out of it. Every song, every dish, every story carries both continents in its DNA. That's what happens when you try to erase a people. They come back louder, stronger, and more creative than before. And that's why the connection still matters today. It's not just about history, it's about inheritance.
The same way a drumbeat can make your soul move without you knowing why. That's your ancestors talking. That's Africa and America in conversation, through you. You ever look in the mirror and feel like you see more than one history staring back at you? That's not your imagination, that's legacy. The truth is, millions of African Americans today carry Native ancestry. DNA tests are just catching up to what grandmothers have been saying for generations. We got Indian in our family. For years, people laughed at that. Now science is proving she was right. Modern genetic studies show that up to a third of African Americans have measurable Native ancestry, and in some regions, that number's even higher. But it's not just about genes, it's about memory. It's about stories passed down when paperwork was used to erase identity. It's about how our features, our skin tones, our languages, and our customs tell stories the records never could. Across the Carolinas, Virginia, and Mississippi, families still remember old tribal names whispered like secrets. Saponi, Lumbee, Nottoway, Choctaw, Creek. People still talk about great-grandparents with long braids, or the old medicine man who healed using roots and prayers. These aren't myths, they're oral archives, the kind history books never wanted to preserve. But here's what's wild. Even though these connections are undeniable, the system still resists acknowledging them. The narrative of America is built on separation. It's cleaner to say Africans were enslaved, natives were displaced, and Europeans conquered. But that's not what really happened. The real story is messy. It's intertwined. It's people crossing paths, falling in love, and building families the system couldn't categorize. And that's exactly why it was hidden. The bloodline is the evidence they couldn't erase. And it's not just genetic, it's cultural. You see it in the way we use herbs and oils for healing, the way we value community over individualism, the way we honor the elders in every gathering. You hear it in the storytelling style, rhythm, repetition, humor, lesson. That's African native fusion, alive and unbroken. Even the hairstyles, braids, beads, wraps, those didn't come from fashion trends. They came from tradition, from centuries of shared identity and protection. African and Native women both wove their culture into their hair, maps, memories, and messages. That's the level of detail these ancestors lived with. Every choice had meaning. So when people try to divide the story, to say African Americans and Native Americans are separate histories, remember that's only because someone wanted it that way. The truth is, they were never separate. The line between them isn't a wall, it's a braid. And that braid still runs through families today. That's the part history can't rewrite. No law, no roll, no census can undo the truth that still lives in people's faces, in their names, in their family trees. The legacy isn't just history, it's inheritance. It's not just something to study, it's something to carry forward.
Every family has that one elder, the one who sits on the porch and tells stories nobody wrote down. The one who says, your great-granddaddy was Cherokee, or your grandma's mama came from Creek Country. Folks used to laugh at those stories, call them old tales, but what they didn't realize was that those tales were history lessons wrapped in memory. They were maps that survived when the official ones got burned. See, when the government started using paperwork to define who people were, it forced entire communities into silence. Native identity was reclassified, erased, or rewritten. People who had lived openly as members of tribes suddenly had to hide it to survive. So the stories went underground, whispered in kitchens, told at funerals, passed down in songs and lullabies. That's how history survived, through voices, not signatures. In a world where your existence depended on what box you checked, oral history became rebellion. Grandmothers taught their children who they were without ever writing it down. They'd say, "Don't forget where you come from," and that sentence carried centuries. That's why, Even generations later, you'll meet Black families who still talk about Native ancestry with certainty, even if there's no paper to prove it, because the story lived longer than the system that tried to silence it. Take the Lumbee people in North Carolina, for example. For centuries, they've claimed both African and Native roots. Officials tried to deny their identity again and again, but they kept their stories alive. Same with the Black Choctaws, the Black Creeks, the Black Cherokees. They kept telling the truth until it couldn't be ignored anymore. Because paper fades, memory doesn't. And that's something deep in our culture. We remember out loud, whether it's through Sunday storytelling, through music, through names passed down for generations. Oral history became the lifeline that paperwork couldn't cut. You can destroy a document, but you can't stop a story that keeps being told. That's why, today, when people start tracing their roots, they're realizing those old stories were never exaggerations. They were warnings that the truth wouldn't survive in books, but it would survive in blood. Our ancestors knew what they were doing. They turned survival into storytelling. They hid truth in plain sight. And now it's resurfacing like it never left. Fast forward to today, and the whispers our grandparents carried are finally meeting the science that can prove them right. DNA testing has cracked open what paperwork tried to bury. People who always felt they had Native roots are now finding evidence, traces of tribes, migration patterns, and genetic links that match the stories they've heard their whole lives. It's not coincidence, it's confirmation. Across America, thousands of Black families are discovering Native ancestry through genetic databases. But even beyond the science, something bigger is happening. Reclamation. People are reclaiming languages, art, and spirituality that once connected their ancestors. They're joining cultural groups, reconnecting with tribes, and piecing together their family lines, one record, one story, one photograph at a time. This new wave of rediscovery isn't about claiming labels, it's about restoring balance. It's about saying, we were here too. Because when you understand how much was taken, finding even a single name on an old registry becomes revolutionary. That name becomes proof that the ancestors weren't lost. They were just waiting to be remembered. Social media has become a modern-day drum circle for this movement. People are sharing family photos, oral histories, DNA results, and stories that link them back to both Africa and the Americas. Strangers are finding cousins through bloodlines broken by history, but reunited by truth. It's not just research, it's resurrection. And tribes themselves are starting to reckon with that history, too. Some nations, like the Cherokee and Seminole, have begun restoring citizenship to freedmen, descendants. Others are reopening conversations about what belonging really means. It's slow, it's complex, but it's happening, because truth always comes back up. This generation isn't just learning history, it's rewriting it with the evidence their ancestors left behind. They're proving that the story of America isn't one of separate races, but of intertwined survival. Africans, natives, and their descendants didn't just share space, they built the foundation of this land together. So when someone says, we're not the same people, they're right. We're stronger. We're the product of every ancestor who refused to disappear. We're the living memory of two continents that crossed paths and made something new, something this world still can't fully name, but something powerful enough to keep rising. Because truth doesn't stay buried, it waits. And when it comes back, it doesn't whisper, it roars. If you really want to see how deep the roots of this history go, don't look in museums, look in the South. Walk through the neighborhoods, listen to the music, taste the food, and you'll see the fingerprints of the first Black and Native alliance everywhere. The South isn't just where those worlds met, it's where they merged.
Every rhythm, recipe, and ritual tells the story of two cultures that refuse to vanish. You can hear it in the music first. Before there was blues, there were field hollers, chants, and stomp rhythms, call and response patterns, born from African villages and native ceremonies. Those early sounds weren't just music, they were communication. People used rhythm to share messages, to lift their spirits, to remember home. When Africans and natives began living side by side, their songs became one. That's why early blues sounds almost tribal, deep, percussive, spiritual. The first banjos were crafted from African instruments, but they carried the same earthy tone as native flutes. Music became the universal language of survival. You can taste the connection too. Southern food didn't just appear out of thin air. It came from the land, from shared knowledge. Africans brought the technique. Natives brought the ingredients. The way we cook cornbread, fry fish, smoke meats, or stew greens, that's fusion before anyone called it that. Gumbo, African roots, native herbs, cornbread, native maize, African preparation. Every bite of Southern food is a history lesson that nobody teaches. Then there's spirituality, the unseen glue. Both African and native beliefs revolved around connection to nature, to ancestors, to spirit. That's why even today, in Southern churches, you can feel something ancient under the hymns, the clapping, the foot stomping, the way the preacher's rhythm rises and falls like a drumbeat. That's not just style, that's heritage. It's ceremony, disguised as worship. Even the sense of place comes from that union. The South's deep respect for the land, the idea that soil holds memory, that's native. The belief that your ancestors walk with you, that their energy lives through you, that's African. When those beliefs merged, it created something bigger than religion. It created community, a people who could find God in the wind, in the water, in each other. And the traditions still live in the small things, the porch gatherings, the storytelling, the way elders command a room, the yes ma'am and no sir that come from honoring your elders, the way both cultures demanded respect. Even the language, the rhythm of Southern speech, that sing-song tone that can turn a story into a sermon, that's African cadence layered over native patience. The South remembers, even when the books don't, because its people are the memory. Every cookout, every church revival, every Sunday gathering is a quiet monument to the alliance that shaped it. That's not lost culture, that's living proof. When the Civil War ended, the world tried to reset. Black and Native communities didn't wait for permission to rebuild. They built their own institutions, schools, churches, bands and towns, not just to survive, but to thrive. These places became the beating heart of a new identity, part African, part native, fully human. Education came first. In Indian Territory and across the South, freedmen and native families opened their own schools because no one else would. The Cherokee and Creek freedmen schools, for example, were run by descendants of people who had walked the Trail of Tears and survived slavery, and they were teaching their children not just math and reading, but pride. Many of the early black colleges in Oklahoma and the Deep South were founded on land once owned by native nations, and their founders often carried both African and native heritage. Education wasn't just learning, it was resistance. Then came the music schools, informal but powerful. Black and native musicians began blending styles in community halls, churches, and fields. They invented genres without realizing it. Gospel, blues, country, jazz. The native love of storytelling fused with the African love of rhythm, and out came songs that told pain, joy, and prophecy all at once. That's why so much of Southern music sounds like prayer, because it is prayer. Whether you call it a powwow or a praise break, It's the same spirit speaking in different tongues. Faith institutions rose right alongside the music. Black and Native communities built churches and ceremonial grounds where both worlds met under one roof. Some services had drums and shouting. Others had silence and smudging. Either way, the goal was the same: connection. Connection to God, to the land, to each other. And it worked. Those gatherings became the emotional backbone of entire towns. You can trace that energy straight to modern-day culture. The first bluesmen and gospel singers, many carried Native ancestry. Some of the early jazz legends, from Louisiana and Mississippi, came from families that blended both lineages. Their sound, that haunting, powerful soul, is what happens when history meets heartbeat. And faith carried them through it all, because both Africans and natives shared one belief: that the system could never erase, that nothing truly dies. The body may pass, the land may change hands, but spirit keeps walking. That belief is why they endured, why they rebuilt, and why even now their stories still echo in our voices. So when we talk about the foundation of the South, its sound, its flavor, its faith, we're not just talking about one people's story. We're talking about the shared inheritance of two civilizations that refuse to bow. That's not just history, that's legacy.
When America went to war with itself, the South wasn't the only battlefield. Identity was. The Civil War didn't just divide the Union and the Confederacy. It split Native nations, black families, and alliances that had lasted for generations. But what most people don't know is that some of the fiercest, most loyal, and most strategic soldiers in that war came from the same mixed heritage America tried to erase: the black natives. When the war began, the 5 civilized tribes, Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, were forced to choose sides. Some leaders aligned with the Confederacy under pressure, others sided with the Union. But within those tribes, the freedmen, black members of the nations, made their own choice to fight for freedom, not politics. They formed regiments, militias, and spy networks. They fought not for a flag, but for a future. The 1st Indian Home Guard and 2nd Indian Home Guard were real military units made up of both Native and black men who fought for the Union in Indian Territory. They defended supply lines, liberated towns, and protected families who refused to return to bondage. These weren't nameless soldiers. They were men who knew they were fighting for 2 histories at once. Many spoke multiple languages: English, Creek, Cherokee, and could move between communities like ghosts. They didn't just fight battles. They carried intelligence, guided troops through terrain no one else understood, and made sure history remembered their courage, even when the textbooks wouldn't. Then there were the Black Seminoles, the same warriors who had fought the U.S. Army decades earlier in Florida. When war broke out, they joined the fight again, this time wearing Union blue. They became scouts, sharpshooters, and protectors, carrying the same defiant spirit their ancestors had. Some later became the legendary Seminole Negro Indian Scouts of the U.S. Army, stationed in Texas after the war. They tracked bandits, guided settlers, and guarded borders, all while being treated like outsiders by the very nation they defended. But they stayed proud, because their fight wasn't for recognition, it was for legacy. And when the war ended, they didn't go back to being silent. Freedmen communities across Indian Territory rebuilt again. They established towns with names that still exist today: Bowley, Redbird, Clearview. They built schools, opened churches, published newspapers. They created what historians now call the Black Wall Streets of Indian Territory, long before Tulsa became famous. These were organized, educated, proud people who refused to let America define them. But here's the thing: their contributions were buried intentionally. The U.S. didn't want a narrative that showed black and native people as nation builders, as soldiers, as architects of progress. It didn't fit the script, so they left them out of the official histories. That's why today, you can search through Civil War archives and find hundreds of names listed as colored, with no mention of their native roots. The truth didn't vanish. It was just hidden behind labels. But that resistance, that unity, that pride, it never stopped. Every generation since has found new ways to resist, through education, through art, through culture, because resistance doesn't always look like war. Sometimes, it looks like building something that wasn't supposed to exist. After the Civil War, when the country started stitching itself back together, America faced a problem, not just political, but cultural. The idea of black and native unity scared them more than ever, because now, those same people who had fought in wars, built towns, and lived freely, were showing the world what independence really looked like. And that didn't fit into the blueprint of a divided society. So they tried again, this time with new tools. Schools, newspapers, laws and movies all worked together to rewrite history. Native identity was painted as vanishing. Black identity was boxed into stereotypes, and the link between the two erased. The textbooks told kids that natives were gone and Africans were enslaved. Period. They left no room for the truth that both were here, together, long before America called itself a nation. They even turned it into entertainment. In the early 1900s, Western movies started shaping how people imagined Native Americans, light-skinned actors in feathers, noble and silent. Meanwhile, black people were shown as background characters, or not at all. They built a visual divide, so powerful it lasted for generations. The image of a dark-skinned native didn't fit Hollywood's fantasy, so they simply erased it. But here's what they couldn't erase: the proof, the faces, the family photos tucked in old Bibles, showing brown children with long braids, the church records listing African and Indian surnames, side by side, the land deeds, passed down quietly in families whose stories never made it to print. The truth was sitting in attics, in DNA, in memory, waiting to be claimed. And when the civil rights era came, that truth started rising again. Black leaders began to rediscover their native ancestry, and native activists began working alongside black movements, from Malcolm X's acknowledgement of native roots to the alliances between the Black Panthers and the American Indian movement. In the 1970s, the bond re-emerged. History was repeating itself, the oppressed finding strength in unity. Again, today, that same spirit lives on. The internet has become a new kind of trail, one that reconnects descendants, exposes hidden archives, and makes it impossible to keep the story buried. People are realizing that their great-grandmother's cheekbones and their uncle's stories weren't imagination, they were inheritance. No matter how many times they tried to divide it, the Black-Native Alliance refused to die, because you can't erase something that was never just political. It was spiritual. It was born from shared struggle, shared respect, and shared survival. The same connection that built the first freedom towns, that fought in every war, that fed and taught generations, it's still here. They tried to erase the alliance from the map, the classroom, and the movies, but they forgot one thing: truth has a pulse, and it's still beating. Let's end this where it always should have begun, with the truth. Pocahontas was not the pale, porcelain princess they painted on your classroom wall. She wasn't some dainty figure who existed just to make peace with colonizers. She was a dark-skinned woman, from a dark-skinned nation, a daughter of Africa's shadow and America's soil, and they couldn't stand that. Every colonial record that described her people said the same thing: tawny, brown, closer to Ethiopians than to Englishmen. Those weren't my words, those were theirs. The Powhatan Confederacy didn't look like Europe. It looked like the sun, copper, gold, and rich.
with the tones of the earth. The traders from Africa who came to these coasts before Jamestown didn't just bring goods, they brought genes, stories, and bloodlines, and that blood mixed with the native nations long before the first Englishman ever set foot here. Pocahontas was born into that, a living reflection of the connection between Africa and America that was already centuries deep. But the colonizers couldn't handle that image. A dark-skinned woman, standing between two worlds, commanding respect, influencing nations. That was too much power for their narrative. So they changed her. They stripped the melanin from her paintings. They softened her story. They made her a peace symbol, instead of the political figure she truly was. They erased her African ties, bleached her heritage, and turned her into a fantasy that could fit inside their version of history. But the truth doesn't fade that easily. You can see it in the old portraits they kept locked away. Her skin darker than they later retouched. You can read it in the words of colonists who compared her people to the Moors. You can trace it in the trade routes that brought Africans to the Chesapeake long before Columbus's name ever mattered. The Powhatan world was part of a black and native network that spanned oceans, not isolated villages waiting to be discovered. She came from that lineage, a lineage of strength, intelligence, and royal diplomacy. They tell you she was the bridge between two worlds. What they don't say is that she was those two worlds, native and African, both born of the earth and the sun. That's why her story was so dangerous. Because if people knew who she really was, they'd have to admit that the first American icon was a black woman, a leader, a diplomat, a descendant of civilizations that existed long before the colonies. So when you see the old drawings, remember that pale image isn't truth, it's revision. The real Pocahontas wasn't drawn with chalk-white skin and soft English features. She was drawn in tones of mahogany and gold. She spoke with the rhythm of two continents. She stood tall in a world trying to shrink her. They called her savage. They called her princess. But what she really was proof. Proof that this land has always been connected to Africa. Proof that blackness isn't new to this soil. It's ancient. Proof that you can repaint a portrait, but you can't repaint the truth. Pocahontas was never theirs to define. She was ours to remember. A daughter of two mighty worlds, and the proof that the first American royalty wore skin kissed by the sun. That's the story they tried to hide. But now that it's out, there's no putting it back.